In the immortal redundant quotes of the great Yogi Berra, it's deja vu all over again. Another test flight of Starship, another disappointing performance, and more speculation as to what went wrong. SpaceX has provided us with information on what allegedly went wrong with all of the previous flights, at least supposedly, but really when it comes down to it, we don't have a lot of technical information or detailed specifics on why these issues are happening, only that they did. And so as a result, we have armchair experts all over the world trying to figure all of this out, and it's left to journalists like me to determine whether or not they want to publicize any of these opinions or just ignore them, because when it comes right down to it, we don't really know anything unless we're engineers working at SpaceX. Well, in my opinion, the best thing to do is to find an article that at least makes some sense to me, and then from there, share this information with my team, some of whom are actually aerospace engineers, get their opinions on the whole thing, and then unload the entire unhealthy concoction on all of you. When it comes right down to it, though, the article that I am going to share with you does make some sense to me, although others vehemently disagree with it, so we'll leave it up to you as to whether or not you think that this does make sense. But just a quick word of warning to save myself from grief. This article has a lot of anti-Elon rants, so I think we need to just filter all of those out while keeping in mind that it kind of damages the credibility of the author when he talks this way. The author, by the way, is Will Lockett, a journalist and engineer, and the title of his article is "SpaceX has finally figured out why Starship exploded, and the reason is even more humiliating than last time." Here we go. Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome again to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. Again, we need to talk about Starship, and again, we're going to talk about what potentially might be wrong with Starship. And of course, any commentary in this regard has to be speculative because SpaceX isn't going to tell us what the issues are. A lot of this stuff is, of course, something that's only going to be discussed behind closed doors at SpaceX, and certainly is not going to be shared with the rest of us, which, as far as Artemis is concerned, is a pretty damn negative thing, in my opinion, because the Office of Inspector General at NASA has the freedom to publish just about anything that's wrong with SLS because it's a NASA rocket. Every little thing that's gone wrong with that rocket, whether it comes to cost overruns, design problems, and other things that have led it to be such a disaster in so many respects, all of that has been shared with the public. Virtually none of the same information can be shared about Starship because even though SpaceX is carrying out a contract on NASA's behalf, it's not the same thing. NASA has outsourced this entire project to SpaceX, and so they can keep all of this stuff confidential to a degree that Boeing cannot. Not exactly a level playing field here, so difficult to determine exactly what issues may be going on with Starship. But we can at least speculate. And an article came out recently that I personally find to be compelling, if you can get past all the anti-Elon propaganda that this guy likes to spew. And as most of you know, those of you who've been watching my channel for a while, you know that I have big problems with Elon, that I don't believe that he should have gotten into politics and gotten into such a divisive field where it would turn so many people against him who might have otherwise been his allies. And it really has turned him into this enormously divisive figure that he didn't used to be. But regardless, I don't think that this article is doing itself any favors. Rather, the author is doing himself any favors by spewing all this anti-Elon propaganda. It undermines his credibility. But nevertheless, when something makes sense to me, I talk about it. And I'm not an engineer. I have, of course, consulted with engineers at a wide variety of different companies, from Sierra Space to ULA and other places when it comes to Starship, but still, I'm not an engineer, so I can't speak with any great authority, but the author of this article is an engineer. Still, that doesn't make him an expert on Starship, nor does it give him any sort of special access to their information either, but still, in my opinion, what this man has to say, at least to some degree, does make logical sense to me. And it's something that doesn't make logical sense to other members of my team, including one who actually has a fair amount of experience in the aerospace field, especially when it comes to rockets. This is one of the few times that I've disagreed with this individual. So I've put all of his opinions out there as well. We're going to do a complete review of this article. Then you guys get to decide what you think about all of this. And please make sure to include it in the comments. So without further ado, let's get down to what may really be wrong with Starship and why.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Starship is an unmitigated failure. That much we all know by now. Told you this guy was biased, but let's continue. Most people still don't understand the full extent of what a terrible failure Starship actually is. At the time of this writing, SpaceX has already spent approximately $10 billion on Starship and hasn't even managed to reach a proper orbit, let alone deliver any payload to space. For comparison, NASA's Saturn V rocket, which was designed and built using more expensive and less accurate old-school analog technology, cost roughly $6.4 billion to develop, and the launch costs were approximately $1.4 billion in today's money. In other words, for the same amount of cash that Musk has splashed on creating a rocket that doesn't work, NASA was able to send astronauts to lunar orbit using technology from the 1960s. And even more embarrassingly for Musk, this sorry saga is only going to get worse. You see, SpaceX recently announced the cause of Starship's spectacular failure during its most recent test flight. Keep in mind, this article was written after Flight 8, but just before Flight 9. And he made a prediction as to what was going to happen, and it turned out to be true, which is one reason that I'm taking him so seriously. In any event, we'll continue, as well as detailing how they plan to solve this problem, which has exposed just how horribly flawed the Starship concept is. Okay, enough of the propaganda. Let's try to get some details. To fully explain these issues, we need to rewind the clocks back to mid-January when Starship's previously failed test flight, Flight 7, was launched. Like all the other attempts, this test failed, with an upper stage disintegrating before it could deliver its dummy payload to orbit. Sure, the Super Heavy booster was able to land, but this isn't particularly impressive when you consider that landing the booster is the easiest part of re-entry because the booster never leaves the atmosphere, not to mention that it has significantly less kinetic energy than the upper stage during landing as a result of its much lower speeds, making the process even easier. Okay, I've never heard anybody understate or just dismiss the incredible difficulty of trying to catch a landing booster. It was an amazing engineering accomplishment, and this is just a silly jab that has no validity in my opinion. Just want to make sure that I share all the details of what this guy writes, just so you have a complete picture. Moreover, this flight only had a 20-ton dummy payload, which is just 13% of what Starship is designed for. And by the way, others in this field have agreed with this assessment. Tori Bruno has said a number of times that Starship is underpowered and has delivered substantially lighter payloads than designed to. But let's continue. This allowed both the booster and upper stage to be lighter, as they required far less fuel, and the rocket engines were less stressed as less thrust was needed. Then how did test flight 7 fail? Well, excessive harmonic vibrations ruptured the fuel lines. Now, that's true. That's what SpaceX has said, creating a gigantic fire that destroyed the entire upper stage mid-flight. This occurred despite the reduced stress placed on the engines and structure itself. Even worse, test flights 7 and 8 were launched using an improved version of Starship, featuring redesigned and strengthened fuel lines to prevent these failures from occurring. So why did this solution not work? Well, Starship has a huge thrust problem. Musk and his engineers overestimated the amount of thrust their Raptor engine could produce while designing Starship. Even Musk himself has publicly stated that Starship can only take less than 50% of its promised payload to orbit, which is likely an overestimate. This means that they are forced to cut down on as much of the craft's weight as possible and push the engines to their limit during launches. Unfortunately, this makes the rocket more fragile and means the engines generate excessive heat and vibrations, which is a perfect recipe for guaranteed failure. For SpaceX's next test flight in March, which was its 8th and most recent test flight at the time of writing, it attempted to solve these problems by reinforcing structural joints and fitting a more capable fire suppression system. However, this added weight forced the dummy payload to be reduced down to 8 tons, which is a mere 5% of Starship's design payload. And even still, this improvement wasn't enough, as Starship blew up spectacularly mid-flight, just like before. At the time, the cause of this failure was apparent to me and many others. It's obvious SpaceX can't make Starship robust enough to survive the thrust required for a fraction of its payload without dramatically increasing its weight, and therefore reducing its payload to nothing. Back then, it was just speculation, but it's not just speculation now. On the eve of Starship's 9th test flight, SpaceX finally revealed what happened during Flight 8. A flash event occurred in one of the rocket's engines, causing it to fail, or more accurately, explode, and take out other engines in the process. This led the rocket to tumbling uncontrollably and disintegrating in the atmosphere. A flash is when a rocket's propellant ignites when it shouldn't, creating a sudden explosion. This can be caused by many things: a fuel leak igniting, an incomplete fuel and oxidizer mix that retards the engine, rapid pressure changes that disrupt the correct flow of fuel and propellant, or even overheating, causing combustion in the wrong places. However, SpaceX has stated that the most probable root cause for the loss of Starship was identified as a hardware failure in one of the upper stage's center Raptor engines. This heavily suggests a fuel leak or an overheating problem, which can be caused by building these engines too light and fragile or pushing them too hard, which all but confirms my and many other speculations. Flight 8 is damning evidence that these engines are being exerted beyond their natural limits and are still incapable of producing enough thrust, as well as that Starship is simultaneously far too heavy and far too fragile to actually function. This is a fatal catch-22 that is baked into the core design of Starship. The concept would only work if the Raptor engines were able to produce the unrealistically high amount of thrust Musk previously claimed, and they simply can't. So how does SpaceX address this issue? Well, with an updated engine, the Raptor 3. This engine is simpler, 7% lighter, and has 21% more thrust than the current Raptor 2. Surely that should solve all these problems, right? Well, no. First of all, Musk has lied about Raptor's thrust before, meaning that his claim of 21% more thrust is seriously dubious. But also, the engine being 7% lighter and having a 21% increase in thrust isn't nearly enough to increase Starship's payload to usable levels. What is more concerning is the method SpaceX used to make this engine so light and powerful. By modifying how the fuel flows, they have improved the engine's internal cooling needs and supposedly eliminated the requirement for external heat shields and a fire suppression system. As a result, they have elected to remove these components, which has made it possible to save this amount of weight. Furthermore, the improved cooling will supposedly may enable them to push the engine harder, creating the aforementioned 21% increase in thrust. In other words, the current engines are being pushed too hard, causing them to fail from fuel leak fires and excessive heat, which has happened so consistently that no Starship has even survived a trip to space with a fraction of its proposed payload on board. Yet somehow, the natural solution is to ditch the engine's heat shields and fire suppression systems. That decision alone would be silly, but then to push these engines 21% harder makes this entire proposal utterly moronic. Even if we assume the Raptor 3 engines have genuinely solved the overheating issue, which is highly unlikely, and can be pushed 21% harder, that doesn't mean they won't experience flashes and subsequent total failure. More thrust will create more vibrations and stress, causing fuel leaks, especially if the lines aren't further enforced, incorrect fuel mixing, and unstable internal pressure. All of these factors can then create flashes, which overheat the engines and quickly develop into huge explosive fires, which will be even more catastrophic than before, as these engines have no heat shields or fire suppression systems. So in short, Raptor 3 won't actually solve the problem plaguing Starship. Now, by the time you read this, SpaceX will likely have conducted its 9th test flight, and because it still uses the Raptor 2 engines and has a dummy payload of 16 tons, it will likely fail in exactly the same manner as Flight 7 and 8 did. And by the way, even though it didn't fail in precisely the same way, it still failed because of fuel leaks, as near as we can tell. So it is interesting that Will Lockett turned out to be pretty prophetic with this article. And it's not just me claiming that, he goes on to say, as the FAA has doubled the size of the vehicle's aircraft hazard area. However, even if they somehow get Starship to safely return and conduct a soft landing, which they didn't, they are still far, far from creating a successful rocket. It's nowhere near reliable enough to be operational and currently has such a tiny payload that SpaceX's own Falcon 9 significantly outperforms it in price and payload. But more importantly, the way SpaceX is trying to develop Starship is utterly foolish. It shows that they are trapped in a catch-22 with no viable way out and are just throwing random stuff at the walls praying that something sticks. This isn't how engineering works, and it isn't pioneering. All it is a waste of U.S. taxes, and once again, he can't hesitate to throw in one more dig against Elon. A waste of U.S. taxes to stroke the ego of a pathetic, lying, wannabe Nazi. So before I give you my take on all of this, I need to share with you the opinions of Darth Rust, who's always been a really strong supporter of this channel and an excellent expert witness when it comes to a lot of these articles, because the guy is in the aerospace field and actually deals with rockets, missiles to be precise, but nevertheless knows a fair amount about the topic. And this is what he said about the article. It isn't technical hubris, is what he says. There's nothing technical in there, and he's making Crayola conclusions with less information than he pretends. He seriously hates Elon to the point where I doubt his ability to be objective about Starship. I recommend against investing any more effort in this article, much less making it into an episode. Well, I guess I don't always accept the advice of my team, but let's go ahead and continue. The reason that this keeps happening to Starship is because it's an in-development vehicle that's years away from performing a mission function. The reason they're having in-flight failure is that SpaceX has chosen to do design validation in flight rather than in software, which makes it a lot more dramatic and somewhat slower in some ways, faster in others. But as much as we focus on the launches, we're still missing the real story. The innovation of Starship isn't the ship, it's it's the shipyard. They are solving the at-scale manufacturing problem, meanwhile throwing away whole stacks because they can. Also, the key quote from the last stream is that progress isn't measured by single events. That's an essential understanding and why it's wrong to expect every launch to be some milestone on the operating architecture. Also, there's a much more fundamental problem. We, all of us, journalists included, need to stop believing Elon when he's talking about dates and numbers. If we've not learned that lesson by now, it's time to go home. I agree with most of what Darth has to say here, but I think we might want to consider adding something else that we need to stop believing Elon about, and that's the performance of his new engines. If he's not being serious about dates and numbers or making exaggerations there, might he also be exaggerating about the promised performance of the Raptor series? Keep in mind that all of these engines, if we are to believe their capabilities as advertised by SpaceX, are more powerful than any engine that has ever been built. Pound for pound, this engine is more powerful than the BE-4 or the RS-25 on the Space Shuttle or even the Saturn V F1. It is an insanely powerful engine if it does indeed perform the way SpaceX says it performs. And up to this point, I haven't seen any evidence to indicate that these engines can actually do what SpaceX says they can do. Now, that could change as time goes on, but I think that's one thing that Mr. Lockett may have hit on the head here. And there's a second point as well. Starship is too heavy. And even though the shipyard is a significant accomplishment and SpaceX has proven their ability to churn out Starships at an insane rate, it doesn't do any good if the upper stage of the rocket is too heavy to deliver the kinds of payloads that Starship was supposed to deliver in the first place. Starship, in my opinion, should not be built out of stainless steel entirely. I think that was a mistake. It saves money during the test phases of all of this, but it isn't going to help with the final product. I think that they made a mistake by moving away from carbon fiber, and let me tell you what I'm talking about. The Starship upper stage is more than 20 times as heavy, dry mass that is, than Falcon 9, meaning that if it wants to deliver just the same performance as Falcon 9, it needs to have 20 times the thrust with the same amount of ISP. Now, even assuming the Raptor performs exactly as advertised, it has approximately 3 times the thrust of a Merlin 1D engine, and Falcon 9 has 1 Merlin 1D on its upper stage, meaning that 6 Raptors should be generating about 18 times the thrust of a Falcon 9 upper stage. Not 20, just 18, and that's if they're performing exactly as advertised. And by the way, the animation you're watching right now dates back to the time that SpaceX was planning to use lightweight carbon fibers, at least for the upper stage, keeping the mass down to a minimum. When everything switched over to stainless steel, it was absolutely vital that the Raptor engines would perform as advertised and to increase the performance of these engines wherever possible. And that is an understandable mistake that might have been made at the time, with engineers going over to stainless steel for cost-cutting reasons, assuming that eventually Raptor would perform as needed. But unfortunately, since it hasn't, once again, keep in mind, we're talking about an engine that's supposed to be able to outperform everything else on the market, including similar Methalox engines like the BE-4. Now SpaceX has no choice but to try to cut down on mass wherever possible, making the upper stage of Starship, and especially its fueling system, a lot more brittle and a lot less resilient. And by the way, Darth is right. I don't have any technical details to prove any of this, but it still makes sense to me. And what I really think that SpaceX should consider doing, and I've been advising this for years now, is switch over to carbon fiber once they start closing in on a production version of Starship. Sure, maybe when you're throwing away a rocket every couple of months right now, it's an expensive alternative, but eventually, by utilizing carbon fibers, that cuts down your overall mass by 75%. And given that the vast majority of Starship's mass is tied up in its hull, I suspect that switching over to carbon fiber would reduce the overall mass of the ship by at least 60%, eliminating the need for Raptors having to overperform or become the most powerful engines on the planet. And most importantly, you could install a much more resilient fuel system and a fire suppression system without having to worry about breaking the bank on your total mass. Not sure if all of this is true or if the solution is that simple, but it might very well be. So there you have it. Is the entire problem, or is the main challenge that SpaceX is facing with Starship in regards to the underperformance of Raptor, or the alleged underperformance of Raptor? Has SpaceX finally overextended themselves and designed an engine that simply does not measure up to what it needs to measure up to in order to make Starship deliver the kinds of performance and the kinds of miracles that Starship was supposed to deliver? Well, only time is going to tell. But once again, as far as my personal opinions are concerned, all of this makes sense, or a lot of it makes sense. I've been saying for years now, those of you watching my channel know this, that Starship is just too heavy. The upper stage, that is, stainless steel, is just too heavy of a material. And in spite of all the advantages that it has brought to the table in the long run, it may be the anchor that weighs this thing down to turn it into Elon Musk's spruce goose, if you will. And because Raptor hasn't been able to deliver quite the power that it needs to, and as I mentioned in the video, you need 20 times the performance of Falcon 9 in order to overcome the incredible dry mass of this upper stage. Well, unless it can actually do that, then you're going to have performance issues. And there's nothing you can do to cut back on the mass of the rocket except by cutting corners on important things like the heat shield or the propellant system, the fuel lines, things that really you can't afford to cut back on when it comes to mass. And in my opinion, if these are indeed the problems, and I think at least to some degree they are, then SpaceX should seriously go back to the drawing board and look at the possible use of carbon fiber. The booster can still be constructed out of stainless steel and still do the job that it needs to do, but the upper stage needs to be lighter. I think if SpaceX is able to do that, to lighten the upper stage without making it less resilient, without making it more inclined to spring leaks and fall apart in orbit, I think that's the only way we're going to see success out of this rocket. And again, to emphasize, I am confident that one way or another, SpaceX is going to be able to overcome the challenges that they face, regardless of what they have to do. One way or another, this company will persevere, they will win through, and they will make this rocket work. But the big problem is our return to the moon is on the line here. And all I can say is, for what it's worth, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that there aren't fundamental design problems, and these are things that with a few more tweaks will eventually be overcome. Because if they aren't, China may very well beat us on the race back to the moon. which is a race we can't afford to lose. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also please consider supporting me on Patreon. It's Patreon support that will ultimately make it possible for me to take the trips and journeys to whether the National Archives, to Starship launches, to various conferences, to do these things without having to do fundraising efforts. If I were to double the Patreon support that I have right now, it would make all the difference in the world. It would make future fundraising drives on my part pretty much unnecessary. Check the description and you get all the details that you need. Thanks again, and as always, stay angry about space.